April 15th, 1945, 50 miles from Berlin. American tanks sit idle on the banks of the Elbe River. General William Simpson asks for permission to advance. Permission denied. That order, issued by Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, remains one of the most debated decisions in military history. Simpson's Ninth Army could have reached Berlin first. Churchill begged for it. Patton demanded it. Montgomery insisted on it. Eisenhower refused them all. The Soviets took Berlin instead, at a cost of 81,000 dead and over 280,000 wounded. The Cold War began in the ruins of that decision. This is the story of why Eisenhower halted at the Elbe and why Berlin went red. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was dying. The question wasn't whether Germany would fall. The question was who would plant their flag on the Reichstag. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine in March. British, American, and Canadian armies swept across Germany's western half. They faced collapsing resistance. Hitler's once mighty Wehrmacht was a shadow force. Old men, teenagers, scattered units running on fumes and desperation. From the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced like an avalanche. They'd fought from Stalingrad to Warsaw, paying in blood for every kilometer. Over 27 million Soviet citizens had died since 1941. Now Stalin's armies stood 35 miles from Berlin on the Oder River. They'd earned their revenge. They intended to collect it. Between these two converging forces lay the German capital, a city of 4 million people, soon to become the most fought-over real estate in Europe. The race for Berlin had begun months before the first shot was fired. In February 1945, the Big Three met at Yalta in the Crimea. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin gathered to divide the carcass of Hitler's Reich before it was fully dead. The mood was celebratory. Victory seemed days away. The hard part, winning the peace, lay ahead. They drew lines on maps. Germany would be split into 4 occupation zones. Britain, France, and America would control the West. The Soviet Union would occupy everything east of the Elbe River. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, would itself be divided into 4 sectors. Each power would get a piece. The zones were formalized in the Occupation Protocol of September 1944 and confirmed at Yalta. Everyone signed. Everyone agreed. The political division of Europe was settled, on paper at least, before the military campaign was finished. Churchill left Yalta uneasy. Roosevelt was visibly failing. Stalin was energized, triumphant, already thinking 3 moves ahead. The Prime Minister sensed the alliance wouldn't survive the war's end. He wanted British and American troops as far east as possible when Germany surrendered. Occupation zones could be negotiated. Facts on the ground could not. But Roosevelt trusted Stalin. Or perhaps Roosevelt simply had other priorities. He needed Soviet help against Japan. He believed in the United Nations, in a stable post-war order built on cooperation. He wouldn't let Churchill complicate things with territorial grab. By spring, the strategic situation was shifting by the hour. General Dwight Eisenhower commanded all Allied forces in Western Europe. He'd led the invasion of Normandy. He'd overseen the liberation of France. He'd managed the egos of Montgomery, Patton, and a dozen other prima donnas while coordinating the largest military operation in human history. Now he faced his final decision. In mid-March, Eisenhower's armies crossed the Rhine at multiple points. The last natural barrier to Germany's heartland fell in days. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial engine, was encircled. Over 300,000 German troops surrendered there, the largest capitulation in Western Allied history. The road to Berlin lay open. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group in the north. Montgomery was methodical, cautious, supremely confident in his own brilliance. He'd wanted a single thrust toward Berlin since Normandy, a concentrated Allied spearhead under his command, naturally smashing straight through to the German capital. Eisenhower had rejected the plan repeatedly, preferring a broad front advance. Now, with Germany crumbling, Montgomery saw his chance. He lobbied Eisenhower for permission to drive for Berlin. He argued it was militarily sound. He implied it was politically essential. Britain had been at war since 1939. British cities had been bombed flat. British soldiers had fought from North Africa to Normandy. Britain deserved a share of the glory. Montgomery's plan called for the U.S. Ninth Army, temporarily under his command, to join his 21st Army Group in the thrust. Together they'd punch northeast, cross the Elbe, and take Berlin before the Soviets arrived. Eisenhower had another general in his ear. George Patton commanded the U.S. Third Army in the South. Patton was aggressive where Montgomery was careful, intuitive where Montgomery was systematic. He hated the Soviets. He saw them as the next enemy, and he wanted Berlin before they got there. Patton told anyone who'd listen that America should take Berlin, Prague, and anything else they could grab. The war against Germany was ending. The war against communism would begin the moment it did. Every mile given to Stalin was a mile America would have to fight for later. Patton's Third Army wasn't positioned for a Berlin run. It was too far south, driving through Bavaria toward Czechoslovakia. But Patton believed in speed and audacity. Give him the order and he'd find a way. Then there was General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. Bradley was Eisenhower's most trusted field commander, calm, competent, unflappable. When Eisenhower needed an honest assessment, he went to Bradley. Bradley ran the numbers. His staff estimated that taking Berlin would cost 100,000 American casualties. Maybe more. The Germans were defending their capital with everything left. Fanatical SS units, desperate Volkssturm militias, Hitler Youth armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. Every street would be a fight, every building a fortress. For what? Bradley asked. For a city 110 miles inside the Soviet occupation zone? For a pile of rubble that would have to be handed over to Stalin anyway? Bradley later wrote that American soldiers looked naively at the British tendency to complicate war with political objectives. He saw Berlin as a purely military problem, and militarily it made no sense. Eisenhower agreed. On March 28, 1945, Eisenhower sent a cable that changed history. It went to Major General John Dean, the U.S. military liaison officer in Moscow. Dean was instructed to deliver a message directly to Joseph Stalin. This was unprecedented. The supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe had never communicated directly with the Soviet leader. But the armies were converging. Coordination was essential. Eisenhower told Stalin that operations had reached the point where knowing Soviet intentions was critical. He outlined his plan. He would encircle the Ruhr, divide Germany's remaining forces, and link up with Soviet armies. The best axis for that junction, he said, would be Erfurt Leipzig-Dresden. Nowhere in the cable did Eisenhower mention Berlin. The omission spoke volumes. Eisenhower had effectively conceded the German capital to the Soviets. When Churchill learned of the message, he was livid. He fired off cables to Roosevelt, to Eisenhower, to the British chiefs of staff. This wasn't just a change in military strategy, Churchill argued. It was a political catastrophe. If the Soviets took Berlin alone, they'd claim they'd won the war single-handedly. The propaganda value would be immense. The post-war implications would be dire. Churchill's protest to Roosevelt was blunt. He warned that if the Soviets captured Berlin, the impression that they'd been the overwhelming contributor to Allied victory would be unduly imprinted on their minds. Wasn't Berlin the ultimate prize? Shouldn't the Western Allies contest it? The British chiefs of staff were equally outraged. They felt Eisenhower had exceeded his authority. Military strategy and political objectives couldn't be separated at this stage of the war. Berlin mattered, not just as a city but as a symbol. Eisenhower remained unmoved. He sent another cable, this one to General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff in Washington. He laid out his reasoning. Berlin, he argued, was not a major military objective. It had lost its strategic importance. The real goal was destroying Germany's remaining field armies and preventing a last stand in the rumored National Redoubt, a supposed fortress in the Bavarian Alps where die-hard Nazis might hold out indefinitely. Eisenhower's plan called for Bradley's 12th Army Group to make the main thrust through central Germany. They'd drive toward Leipzig and Dresden, cutting the country in half and meeting Soviet forces at the Elbe. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would advance in the north, securing German ports and blocking Soviet access to Denmark. Patton's Third Army would sweep through the south, clearing Bavaria and Austria. Berlin would be left to the Soviets. Marshall backed Eisenhower completely. So did the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. They sent a message to the British. Eisenhower was best positioned to judge strategy. He had the right to communicate with Stalin as commander of Soviet forces. His plan represented no change from previously agreed objectives. The reality was simpler than the diplomacy. By April 1945, the American military machine dominated the Western Allied war effort. The U.S. provided the majority of troops, tanks, aircraft, and supplies. Britain's contribution, while invaluable, represented roughly 1/4 of total Allied strength in Europe. The British could protest, but American decisions would prevail. Churchill tried one last appeal. On March 31st, he sent Roosevelt a private message. He noted that Berlin remained highly important. His fall would have profound psychological effects. He urged FDR to reconsider. Roosevelt's reply was friendly but firm. Eisenhower had his full support. Military commanders, not politicians, should direct military operations. The question of Berlin would be resolved by the men on the ground. 12 days later, Franklin Roosevelt was dead. A cerebral hemorrhage took him on April 12, 1945. Harry Truman became president. The decision about Berlin had already been made. By mid-April, events were moving faster than anyone anticipated. On April 11th, Lieutenant General William Simpson's Ninth Army reached the Elbe River at Magdeburg. They'd advanced so quickly that German resistance barely materialized. Simpson's forward units secured bridgeheads on the river's western bank. They were 50 miles from Berlin. Soviet forces on the Oder were 35 miles away, but they hadn't yet launched their final offensive. Simpson could taste it. His men could taste it. Berlin was there for the taking. On April 14th, Simpson asked Bradley for permission to push on to the German capital. He had the men. He had the momentum. A few American correspondents had driven jeeps to the outskirts of Berlin without encountering resistance. The Germans seemed to have stopped fighting in the West. They were saving everything for the Russians. Bradley consulted Eisenhower. The answer came back the next day. No. Simpson was ordered to halt at the Elbe. He was forbidden to advance further. His bridges sat unused. His tanks stayed idle. The Ninth Army would wait. Simpson later called it the bitterest moment of his military career. On April 16th, the Soviets launched their final offensive. Over 2.5 million Red Army soldiers smashed into German defensive lines on the Oder. Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanded the First Belarusian Front, attacking from the east. Marshal Ivan Konyev led the First Ukrainian Front, striking from the southeast. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front covered the north. Stalin had set his marshals in competition. Whoever reached the Reichstag first would claim eternal glory. The race was brutal. The Germans fought like men possessed. At Seelow Heights, just east of Berlin, they'd prepared defenses in depth. Trenches, minefields, interlocking fields of fire. When Soviet searchlights blazed on the morning of April 16th, intended to blind German defenders, they instead silhouetted attacking Red Army troops. German machine guns cut them down in waves. Zhukov's initial assault was a disaster. His casualties mounted by the thousands. Stalin called him personally, demanding results. Zhukov threw in his reserves, abandoning tactical finesse for brute force. Over 700 Soviet tanks were destroyed at Seelow Heights alone. The Red Army suffered 30,000 casualties. 3 times the German total, in 4 days of fighting. But the sheer weight of Soviet numbers was unstoppable. By April 19th, Zhukov's forces had broken through. They rolled toward Berlin. On April 25th, 2 events converged. At Torgau on the Elbe River, American and Soviet troops met for the first time. First Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue of the U.S. 69th Infantry Division crossed the river in a boat. On the eastern bank, he met Soviet soldiers from a Guards Rifle Regiment. Later that day, 2nd Lieutenant William Robertson met Soviet Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko on the destroyed Torgau Bridge. They embraced. Photographers captured the moment. An American and a Russian, arms around each other, smiling, their national flags behind them. The image went global. Germany had been cut in two. That same day, Soviet forces completed the encirclement of Berlin. The battle for the city had already begun. Berlin's defenders were a desperate mix. Some were hardened SS veterans, fanatics willing to die for the Führer. Most were Volkssturm, conscripted civilians, old men and boys given rifles they barely knew how to fire. Hitler Youth, some as young as 12, manned anti-tank positions. They'd been told dying for Germany was the highest honor. Many believed it. The Soviets brought overwhelming firepower. Nearly 2 million artillery shells pounded the city. T-34 tanks rolled through streets, demolishing buildings. Any resistance drew immediate, devastating response. A single sniper could trigger an artillery barrage that leveled an entire block. The fighting was house to house, room to room, brutal beyond measure. Soviet soldiers had seen what the Germans had done to their homeland. They'd liberated the death camps. They'd found mass graves. Many wanted revenge. Atrocities followed: mass rape, looting, murder. Civilians suffered alongside soldiers. German resistance varied wildly. Some units surrendered immediately. Others fought to the last man. At the Halensee Bridge, 300 French volunteers from SS Sturmbataillon Charlemagne held off Soviet attacks for 48 hours. 3 German soldiers with a single machine gun defended the Halensee Bridge for 2 days before they were killed. Hitler remained in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. He issued orders to armies that no longer existed. He moved phantom divisions on maps. He believed salvation would come. When told Roosevelt had died on April 12th, he briefly thought the alliance might fracture, that Germany might yet be saved. No salvation came. On April 30th, with Soviet troops blocks away, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. Eva Braun, whom he'd married the day before, died with him. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery Garden. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. The red flag flew over the Reichstag. The Battle of Berlin was over. The Second World War in Europe had days left. The price had been staggering. According to Soviet archives declassified decades later, the Red Army lost 81,116 dead in the Berlin operation. Another 280,251 were wounded or fell sick. Nearly 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns were destroyed. German military deaths numbered between 92,000 and 100,000. An estimated 125,000 civilians died. Total casualties, military and civilian combined, exceeded 500,000 people. In 3 weeks. For one city, Bradley's estimate of 100,000 American casualties for taking Berlin had been conservative. Eisenhower's decision was immediately debated. Churchill wrote in his memoirs that history would judge whether the Western Allies should have taken Berlin. He believed they should have. He believed the post-war world would have been different. Others disagreed. General Marshall and the U.S. Joint Chiefs argued that Eisenhower had made the militarily sound choice. Why take casualties for land that would be handed over anyway? The occupation zones had been agreed. No political directive had ever told Eisenhower to ignore those agreements. Historian Stephen Ambrose later noted the central myth, that if Americans had captured Berlin, they would have held it, and there would be no Berlin problem. That myth ignored reality. The zones were settled at Yalta. Roosevelt had agreed. Truman inherited that agreement. No American president would have violated it. The counterargument persisted. Perhaps occupying Berlin would have strengthened America's negotiating position with Stalin. Perhaps seeing Western troops in the Soviet zone would have forced Stalin to compromise. Perhaps the Cold War could have been avoided or at least softened. We'll never know. What we know is this: when Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe on April 25th, they embraced as allies. They exchanged souvenirs. They drank together. They believed they'd won a great victory together, that the future would be shaped by cooperation. Within months, the Iron Curtain fell. East Germany became a Soviet satellite. Berlin became a divided city. The friendship at Torgau became a memory, then a symbol, then a relic of a brief moment when two systems stood together. Years later, Lieutenant William Robertson and Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko met again. It was 1975, during détente, 30 years after their handshake on the Elbe Bridge. They embraced again, older now, shaped by 3 decades of Cold War. Silvashko told American interviewers that until 1975, even mentioning that he'd met Americans in 1945 had been dangerous. The Soviet state had relegated him to teaching school, punishing him for contact with the West. Robertson and Silvashko stayed friends until they died. They represented what might have been. Eisenhower never regretted his decision. He believed Berlin had no military value worth American lives. He believed the occupation zones would be honored. He believed his job was to end the war quickly, not to position pieces for the next one. He was right about the cost. He may have been wrong about the politics. In September 1945, Eisenhower addressed the question directly. He said that critics who claimed America should have raced for Berlin, Prague, and other capitals failed to understand that such actions wouldn't have prevented Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. The zones were agreed. The Soviets had earned their sphere of influence with 27 million dead. No amount of Western occupation would have changed Stalin's intentions. But Churchill's warning echoed through the decades. The Soviets did claim overwhelming credit for defeating Germany. They did use Berlin's capture as propaganda. The post-war division of Europe did follow exactly the lines Churchill feared. Patton, who'd screamed for permission to take Berlin and Prague, never got his wish. He died in December 1945, killed in a car accident in occupied Germany. Conspiracy theories followed. Some claimed he was assassinated to prevent him revealing Eisenhower's collaboration with the Soviets. No evidence supports the theory, but it persists. Montgomery carried his bitterness to the grave. He believed Eisenhower had robbed Britain of its rightful role in the war's finale. He believed a single thrust, his thrust, would have ended the war faster and on better terms. Simpson never publicly criticized the decision that stopped him 50 miles from Berlin. He was a soldier. He followed orders. But he never forgot what might have been. The decision at the Elbe was Eisenhower's to make. History has judged it from every angle: military, political, moral. No consensus exists. Perhaps none ever will. What's certain is this: on April 15, 1945, Dwight Eisenhower chose to halt his armies at the Elbe River. He chose to let the Soviets take Berlin. He chose to trust agreements over advantages, strategy over symbolism, American lives over political positioning. That choice shaped the world we inherited. Berlin became the Cold War's flashpoint. The wall went up. Kennedy stood before it and proclaimed, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Reagan stood before it and demanded it be torn down. It stood for 28 years, a concrete monument to decisions made in April 1945. The wall fell in 1989. Berlin reunified. Germany reunified. The Cold War ended. But the questions remain. Could Eisenhower have prevented it? Should he have tried? Were the 100,000 American lives he saved worth the decades of division that followed? Every generation asks. Every generation answers differently. At Torgau, where Robertson and Silvashko embraced in 1945, there's a monument now. A plaque reads, "In the name of those who have fallen on the battlefields, those who have left this life, and in the name of their descendants, the way to war must be blocked." It's called the Oath of the Elbe. The irony is rich. The meeting at the Elbe was meant to prevent war. Instead, it marked the beginning of one. A Cold War, fought with proxies and propaganda, that lasted half a century. Eisenhower halted at the Elbe because he believed the war was won. He was right, but he didn't see that another war was beginning. Few did. Roosevelt didn't live to see it. Churchill saw it coming but couldn't stop it. Stalin planned for it before the guns went silent. The race for Berlin ended on May 2, 1945, when the red flag flew over the Reichstag. The Soviets won. The price was paid in blood, Soviet blood, German blood, civilian blood. Over 500,000 people died for one city in 3 weeks. Simpson's Ninth Army sat at the Elbe 50 miles away and watched. Eisenhower's decision was final. The Cold War was inevitable. Berlin became the symbol of a divided world. And in the ruins of that decision, two superpowers rose to face each other across an iron curtain that would stand for 44 years. This was just one of countless decisions that shaped the Second World War and the world that followed. If you want to hear more stories from history's turning points, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Drop a comment telling us which moment you want to explore next.